It was one of those nights that made you question everything. The kind of cold that crept into your bones, wet and heavy, rain mixed with snow, and a darkness so deep you could barely see your own hands. Gunshots cracked through the air, echoing across the hills like angry spirits. And somehow, in all that chaos, fear didn't stop him. Virgil Nishimura, or Westdale as he'd later be known, just kept pushing forward. But this story didn't begin in the mud or the gunfire. It started in Grand Rapids, Michigan, far from the battlegrounds of Europe. Back home, people were still enjoying their peacetime comforts. Radios played jazz, kids played ball in the streets, and most Americans, at least the white ones, didn't feel the war just yet. But for Virgil, it was already personal. My mother was American, and my father was born in Kumamoto, Japan, he'd later say. His voice was calm, steady, like he'd made peace with the past, even the parts no one else wanted to hear. They married in Denver. I stayed in college, worked summers to make some money, and ended up getting into acrobatic flying. Flying. That was his dream. It wasn't just a hobby or a thrill. It was freedom. In the skies, there were no sideways glances, no whispered slurs, no one asking where your real family was from. Up there, it was just clouds, wind, and endless possibility. And he was good at it. Too good to ignore. When Virgil joined the War Training Service, the WTS, they needed pilots bad. And he shot straight to the top of his group. Every training group after that, he climbed just as fast. Not because of connections or privilege, because he loved it. Truly loved to fly. But love means little in a world built on suspicion. Then came the day everything shifted. The radio crackled with the voice of a shaken broadcaster. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, a date which will live in infamy. And just like that, Virgil wasn't a promising pilot anymore. He was Japanese. He was the enemy. They came for me, he said. One day I went out for advanced training. They told me a guy wanted to see me. He was a flight inspector from the government. And just like that, he asked for my license. My private flying license, no explanation. No charges, no trial. Just quiet humiliation. I gave it to him, Virgil said. He kept it for 5 months. I was out of the program, out of everything. For 5 months, Virgil sat on the sidelines, watching the country he'd called home treat him like a threat. While others soared into combat, he was grounded, not because he lacked skill, but because of his name. Nishimura. He knew what had to be done. I decided to do something, he said. I translated my name. Nishi means west, and Mura means village. Someone joked, how about hill and dale? And I thought, yeah, that works, Westdale. The new name rolled off his tongue easier, less threatening, less foreign. It wasn't just a name change. It was survival. With his new identity, Virgil tried again. He went to the Air Corps, raised his hand, and said, I do, like every other American man in uniform. His skill was undeniable. In no time, he was asked to become a flight instructor. It should have been a victory, but instead, it became another bitter lesson. I was at the top, he recalled. Then they transferred me from the Air Corps to the Army, as a private. Lowest you can go? No explanation, no reason. Just the crushing reminder that no matter how hard he worked, how American he tried to be, he was still different in their eyes. And worst of all, they didn't even let him fly, but Virgil didn't quit. They put him with the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, a unit mostly made up of Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans just like him. Men who had everything taken from them, homes, businesses, dignity, and still chose to fight for a country that didn't want to claim them. They weren't sent to the Pacific. The government didn't trust them enough for that. Instead, they shipped out to Europe. Italy first. When we got there, I saw how bad things really were, Virgil said. Flies everywhere. People eating from garbage cans. Mussolini shouldn't have dragged his country into war. Rome was off limits. But once, I remember walking into a courtyard with dozens of GIs. He paused, a smile tugging at his voice. Someone said, "Look who's coming out." And there he was, Pope Pius XIII, standing on a little balcony, blessing us all. That stayed with me. It really did. Even in the middle of a war, there were moments of grace, small pieces of humanity that reminded you what you were fighting for. And Virgil clung to that, because the worst was still ahead. The smell of wet earth and smoke clung to everything. France was colder, harsher than Italy had been. The sky always seemed gray, like it forgot how to be blue. And by the time the 522nd joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in the Vosges Mountains, Virgil could feel it in his bones. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were tools. Disposable. The 422nd was made up almost entirely of Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, many with families locked behind barbed wire back home in internment camps. They fought with a kind of quiet rage, not just for their country, but to prove they belonged to it in the first place. "They didn't trust us," Virgil had once said. But when they ran out of options, guess who they called? It was General Dahlquist who gave the order. One of his battalions had been surrounded by German forces, completely cut off. They were known as the Lost Battalion, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment. For days, they'd been pinned down in the Vosges forest, with no food, no water, and German shells falling like hail. Dahlquist had already sent others to rescue them. It didn't work, and now, with pressure from the top and his own pride on the line, he turned to the 442nd. "I want the 2nd Battalion to go in there at midnight," he ordered. Midnight. Pitch black. Raining. Snowing. Mud, thick as cement. And somewhere ahead, Germans, machine guns, and maybe the men they were supposed to rescue. "You couldn't even see in front of you," Virgil said. It was that dark. And we were being shot at from everywhere. The orders were clear. But there was a problem. A fatal mistake. Dahlquist gave a coordinate for the artillery to fire on, the same spot where the Lost Battalion was believed to be. If they followed orders, they'd be firing on the very men they were trying to save. "Imagine that," Virgil said. "We're trying to rescue these guys, and headquarters tells us to blow them to pieces." But the 442nd's artillery hesitated. They held back. They used their own scouts, their own judgment, and refused to pull the trigger until they were sure. They ended up saving 201 men. But the cost? "We lost over 800 to casualties," Virgil said. "Do the math. We saved 200 and lost 800. His voice was always calm, always even when he told the story. But you could feel the weight behind the words. You could hear the bitterness that never fully left. That's a big difference there. Afterwards, General Dahlquist lined up the survivors, what was left of the 442nd, and ordered them to stand in formation for inspection. He wanted to see how many men he had. But the sight that greeted him was haunting. Bloodied, bruised, broken. Entire companies reduced to a handful of exhausted, dirt-covered soldiers. These weren't troops anymore. They were ghosts still walking. "Where is everybody?" Dahlquist asked, confused. "They're all dead, sir," came the reply. "Still, no medals, no honors, just more silence." They started calling them the Purple Heart Battalion, not because of any ceremony, but because almost every man in the unit had been wounded or killed, and yet the worst injustice wasn't on the battlefield. In April of 1945, as Germany's grip weakened, the 522nd pushed deeper into Nazi territory. One captain, Feibelmann, and 3 enlisted men scouted ahead and stumbled into a place no one was prepared for. Dachau. The concentration camp was still standing, still filled with the living and the dead. Feibelman was broadcasting what he was seeing over the radio, Virgil said. And they told him, get out of there immediately or face court-martial. The reason? Not military secrecy. Not danger. It was racism. They didn't want the Americans to be represented by the 442nd, Virgil said, because we were Japanese. The 45th Infantry Division arrived shortly after, with tanks and cameras. They got the credit. They got the headlines. We were there first, Virgil said quietly. There's no history about it at all. They wiped everything. When the soldiers from the 45th saw the 442nd standing at the barricades, they froze. They thought we were Japanese soldiers, Virgil said. Didn't take long to tell them we were Americans. But the damage was done. No photos, no records, no recognition. Just another piece of history that got buried because the truth was too inconvenient. Still, they held their heads high. Through it all, the internment camps, the slurs, the broken promises, the suicide missions, they fought like hell. They saved lives. They bled for a country that didn't want them, and they never stopped being American. By the time November of 1945 came around, the war was over. But peace didn't come easy. Not to men like Virgil. Not to those who had given everything and still felt like strangers in their own country. He was standing on the deck of a massive ship, surrounded by thousands of other GIs. Most of them white, most of them smiling, excited, already talking about what they were going to do once they got home. Virgil didn't say much. He just stood quietly, eyes locked on the gray horizon, waiting for that first glimpse of land. And then he saw her, the Statue of Liberty. He raised his hand and saluted. Not because someone told him to, not out of duty, but because for him it meant something. That statue had stared out across the Atlantic for over half a century, a symbol of hope, freedom, and promise. But for Virgil, it wasn't just a symbol. It was a test, because now he was coming home. Not as a Japanese American who'd been grounded for his last name, not as a second-class citizen, but as a decorated soldier who'd survived some of the worst fighting in Europe. A man who had watched friends die in the mud, who had walked through the gates of Dachau and seen what evil really looked like. And still, he came back an American. But America didn't change just because he had. The return home wasn't lined with parades for the 442nd. There were no interviews, no politicians shaking hands, no celebrations, just cold stares and half-hearted nods. When we got back, Virgil said, we didn't get the same kind of welcome. Some people still didn't trust them. Others just didn't care. The war was over, and America wanted to move on. Fast. But for men like Virgil, it wasn't that simple. You don't just step off a battlefield and pretend everything's fine. He tried to find work again, tried to get back into flying, but even then, the doors weren't exactly open. I went to apply for a job as a commercial pilot, he said, but they told me they weren't hiring. Not people like me. It wasn't spoken out loud. Not anymore. But it was there. In the looks, the tone, the careful way they said, we'll call you. They never did. Virgil didn't give up, though. He never had. He couldn't, so he moved on. Took whatever work he could find. Became a postman, delivering letters in Grand Rapids. Rain, snow, heat, none of it mattered. After surviving the war, walking a few miles every day with a mailbag didn't feel so hard. But there was still a quiet sadness in him, a kind of ache that never fully went away. Not from the war. From being forgotten, the men of the 442nd had earned their place in history. They were the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for their size and length of service. Thousands of Purple Hearts, hundreds of bronze and silver stars, 21 Medals of Honor. But nobody talked about them. Their families were still recovering. From internment, from financial ruin, from the shame America tried to stamp on them during the war. And those medals? They didn't fix that. Virgil didn't ask for praise. He didn't need a parade, but he wanted truth. He wanted the story told right. That's why, years later, when people finally started to listen, really listen, he told it all. He talked about the injustice of losing his pilot license, the humiliation of being stripped of rank and sent to dig trenches, the terror of fighting in the dark, surrounded by snow and bullets, the heartbreak of watching the army try to erase their part in liberating Dachau, the pride in seeing the Statue of Liberty again, and the pain of being forgotten. But in his voice, there was no hate, just memory. Because even if America had tried to turn its back on him, Virgil had never turned his back on it. He had fought harder than most, not just against the enemy overseas, but against the enemy within. Prejudice, fear, ignorance. And in the end, he won. Because he survived. He lived to tell the story. The war might have ended on paper, but it never really left the hearts of the men who fought it, especially not Virgil's. He was back in Grand Rapids, walking the same streets he once knew, but everything felt different. Like time had shifted slightly, like the world had moved on without him. People looked at him strange sometimes. Some would smile, but others, they'd squint, do a double take, like trying to figure out whether he was one of them or one of us. It was the kind of look that said, "You fought for this country? Really?" He didn't bother answering. He just kept walking. Letters to deliver, miles to cover, day after day. The funny thing was, he'd faced artillery shells, machine gun fire, even Hitler's reinforcements. But it was the silence that hurt the most now. The silence of a country that didn't want to remember what it had done to him, or what he had done for it. He never forgot the faces of the ones who didn't come back. The men from the 442nd who had marched into hell with him and never made it out. There was Takeshi, the kid from California who used to hum old Japanese folk songs while cleaning his rifle. He was blown apart in the Vosges. A single mortar round, gone just like that. And Saito, always writing letters to his little sister in Idaho, who waited every week for him to write back. He never did. His last words, bleeding out in the snow, were, "Tell her I tried to come home." Virgil never did get the chance to write her. He carried that guilt quietly, like a stone in his chest. Then there was Corporal Masuda, a man who fought like he had something to prove every single day. And maybe he did. Maybe they all did. Masuda took 2 bullets to the chest, dragging another man to safety. Didn't even cry out. He died with his eyes open, Virgil remembered, like he was still looking out for the rest of us. These weren't just fellow soldiers. They were brothers, and they were gone. Virgil would sometimes lie awake at night, listening to the rain tap against the window, and he'd see it all again. The mud, the fog, the crack of gunfire, men screaming in the dark. Not all wounds bleed. Some just sit there, deep inside, waiting to surface when it's quiet enough to hear. But he kept going. His parents, especially his father, never spoke much about the war. They'd lived through the internment quietly, like so many others. Their home, their dignity, all taken with a single executive order. No warning, no apology. Just buses, barbed wire, and guards with rifles. When Virgil visited them, he noticed how they tried to act like everything was normal. They offered tea, smiled politely, asked about work. But behind the smiles was a sadness they didn't have words for. He once asked his father if he felt betrayed. His father just looked at him, long and hard, and said, "We were always guests here. You were the only one who believed you belonged." That stung, because he did believe he belonged. Still did, even after everything. But some nights, that belief felt more like a battle than a comfort. One Sunday, Virgil was asked to speak at a small community center. Just a few people, mostly veterans, some kids. They wanted to hear about the war, He stood at the front of the room, holding a yellowed photo of his unit. Eyes looked up at him, waiting. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he said, "You know, people always ask what we fought for. Freedom? Pride? Country? Maybe. But me? I fought for the right to walk down the street and not be seen as the enemy." A few people shifted in their seats. Some nodded. One man in the back clapped slowly. "Sometimes," Virgil added, "your own country makes you fight twice. Once on the battlefield, and once when you come home." Afterward, a young woman approached him. "My grandfather was in the 442nd, she said, tears in her eyes. "He never talked about it. But now I think I understand why." Virgil nodded. "Sometimes silence is the loudest thing we carry." Years passed like falling leaves, slowly at first, then all at once. One by one, the men of the 442nd grew older. Some settled into quiet lives, working behind counters or in post offices, teaching, raising families, trying to forget. Others never made it home in one piece, even if they returned breathing. Virgil kept delivering mail, kept his head down. He'd taken his uniform, medals, and folded them into a box in his closet. It wasn't shame. It was just exhaustion. Telling people what really happened was harder than staying silent. Not because he couldn't, but because no one wanted to hear. At least, not yet. America was busy. New wars came. New enemies. The country found new people to distrust. The story of the Japanese-American soldiers was quietly pushed aside. The textbooks didn't mention them. Teachers didn't teach about the internment camps. And if they did, they skipped the part where the prisoner's sons saved a battalion in France. It was like history had a broom and knew exactly what to sweep under the rug. But time has a funny way of digging up what gets buried. It started with whispers. A professor at a university digging into declassified military files. A journalist chasing a forgotten headline. A grandson who found his grandfather's uniform in an attic trunk and started asking questions. And little by little, the story of the 442nd came back into the light. Virgil was in his 60s when he got the first call. "Mr. Westdale? We're organizing a veterans event. We'd be honored if you could speak." He was quiet for a second. Then he asked, "Do you know who I am? What we were?" The man on the phone replied, "Yes, sir. We do now." That was the first time in years Virgil pulled the box from the closet. Inside it, medals dulled by time, his flight wings, and a photo. Dozens of young Japanese-American faces staring back at him, some smiling, some serious, most long gone. At the event, the room was packed, full of veterans, students, and reporters. The mayor showed up. So did the local news. But Virgil didn't care about the cameras. He stood at the microphone, old but upright. No notes, just memory. He spoke about losing his license, about being demoted for no reason, about saving 201 men and losing 800 brothers, about Dachau, about the truth. "I want you to remember something," he said, voice firm. "We weren't fighting to prove we were American. We were already American. We were fighting to remind everyone else." The applause lasted minutes. From that day on, invitations poured in. Universities, museums, documentaries. For decades, they'd ignored him. Now they wanted his story. Not for pity, but for truth. He traveled to speak in California, Washington, D.C., even Hawaii. Each time someone would cry. Sometimes it was the children of men from the 442nd. Sometimes it was just people who realized, finally, what had been done. At one event, a woman brought him a photograph of her uncle, who died in the Vosges. She placed it in his hand, trembling. "I never knew who he fought beside," she whispered. "Now I do," Virgil smiled. He was family. By the 1990s, Congress had finally acknowledged the injustice done to the Japanese-American community. In 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, offering a formal apology and symbolic reparations to survivors of the camps. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Then, in 2000, 55 years after the war, the U.S. government awarded 21 Medals of Honor to Japanese-American soldiers, including members of the 442nd. For many families, it was bittersweet. The medals arrived long after the men who earned them had passed away. Virgil attended the ceremony in Washington, D.C. He wore his old uniform jacket. It still fit. He didn't take the stage. He didn't need to. He watched as a younger generation stood up to carry the story forward. Sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, and felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. History had finally remembered them. And yet, even then, it wasn't about medals or speeches. For Virgil, the real honor was in knowing the truth had survived. That people knew now what really happened, who the 402nd were, and what they gave up. Because they hadn't just saved a battalion, they'd saved a piece of America's soul. In the final chapters of his life, Virgil Westdale lived like a man who had made peace with the world, but not by forgetting. He forgave, but he carried every name, every face, and every injustice like a quiet flame that never went out. It burned behind his calm voice, behind the polite smile he wore when people asked, "How was the war?" As if it were a movie he watched once. He still lived in Grand Rapids, still kept a simple routine. His house was modest. No fancy displays, no military plaques hung in the hallway. But tucked in the corner of his study was a small shelf with 2 photos. One of his parents, dressed formally, the day before they were sent to the internment camp. The other, his unit, the 442nd, young men in uniform, some with their arms crossed, some with barely shaved faces, all of them frozen in time, unaware of the legacy they were about to leave behind. When people visited, they sometimes asked him why he didn't move somewhere warmer, easier, Florida maybe, or California. He always chuckled and said, "After that winter in France? This is nothing." But the truth was, Virgil didn't run from cold. He'd lived through far worse. As he aged, something unexpected began to happen. Schools, the same ones that once skipped over his story, started inviting him to speak. He stood before kids who looked nothing like him, telling them about the day the government took his flying license away because of his name. He told them about marching through snow, being ordered to fire on his own men, about walking through the gates of Dachau, only to be erased from the story. The kids listened, really listened, and sometimes they cried. "I thought racism ended after Martin Luther King," one 7th grader said after his talk. Virgil gave a sad smile. Sometimes it just changes clothes. He didn't speak with bitterness, though. That's what struck most people about him. He told the truth, yes. He didn't sugarcoat it, but he didn't demand anything either. Not pity, not applause, just understanding. One winter afternoon, he visited a middle school. After his presentation, a quiet girl approached him. She was the only Asian student in the room, and her hands shook as she handed him a drawing. A simple pencil sketch of him standing in uniform, the American flag behind him. "My parents say we don't belong here," she whispered. "But after hearing you, I think we do." Virgil's eyes softened. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You already belong," he said. "You just have to remind the world." Later that year, Virgil was invited to an event in Washington again. This time it wasn't a military ceremony. It was a historical preservation effort. They were collecting stories for a national archive, and they wanted his. He sat in front of a camera, lights glaring, microphone clipped to his shirt. The woman behind the lens asked, "Mr. Westdale, if you could say one thing to the people of this country, what would it be?" He paused, not because he didn't know, but because it mattered. "I'd say, remember what silence does. Remember what fear makes people do to each other. But also remember what we're capable of when we stop seeing each other as the enemy." Then, quietly, he added, "And remember us, the ones who were almost erased." That footage was later used in a documentary. It was streamed in classrooms. His words reached more people in death than in life. A strange truth, but one that didn't surprise him. By the time he was in his 90s, Virgil had done more interviews than he could count. He never charged a dime. He didn't want fame. He wanted truth to outlive him. He never remarried after the war. He said once that love came close, but after what he saw in Europe, the bodies in the snow, the camps, the betrayal, his heart was too heavy to give away. Instead, he gave his time, his stories, his voice, and in doing so, he gave meaning to the suffering. Not justification. Not peace, but meaning. As the years wore on, his steps slowed. His voice became thinner, but his memory, that stayed sharp. To the very end. The last stretch of Virgil Westdale's life was quiet, but not empty. He was no longer a forgotten soldier or an overlooked veteran. By now, the world had caught up to his story. Students studied the 442nd in classrooms. Documentaries told their truth. He would occasionally receive letters from people he'd never met, handwritten notes from teenagers, teachers, and even veterans from other wars. One read, "Mr. Westdale, I never learned about the 442nd in school. I saw your interview online. I cried. Thank you for fighting 2 wars, one abroad and one at home. You're a hero to me." He kept every letter in a box right next to the photos of his unit. On slow days, he'd take them out and read a few, sometimes smiling, sometimes wiping his eyes. It wasn't about the praise. It was about being seen, about knowing that finally, someone understood. At 96, his body slowed, but his mind was still sharp. He remembered names most people had forgotten, battlefields that no longer existed, camp gates that should have never been built. And he remembered a promise he made to himself when he was just a young man being stripped of his pilot's license. If I survive this war, I will never let them forget who we were. In his final years, that promise kept him going. He was invited to visit an exhibit at the National World War II Museum, where a permanent display honoring the 442nd had been unveiled. Photos, letters, weapons, medals, a full wall with the names of the fallen. Virgil stood there for a long time, cane in one hand, his other resting against the glass case. His eyes scanned the names, row after row. He whispered a few out loud. Saito, Masuda, Takeshi, gone, but never lost. I carried them all this time, he said quietly to a staff member. I just needed someone else to carry them now. The museum director, a middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes, placed her hand on his shoulder and replied, "We will." Back home in Grand Rapids, Virgil moved into a small care facility. Nothing fancy, a private room, a window that looked out onto trees. He still got the paper delivered, still listened to old radio jazz in the evenings, still read history books, just to see how honest they were finally becoming. Visitors came often, students doing school projects, historians, a few filmmakers, and sometimes just curious strangers who wanted to meet the quiet man whose story had once been erased. He never turned anyone away. When asked how he kept going after everything, he would say, "I had no choice. If I gave up, they would have been right about us, and I couldn't let that happen. But time waits for no one." One morning, he didn't come to breakfast. A nurse found him still in bed, peaceful, arms folded over his chest, his dog tags resting on the table next to him. The photo of his unit sat beside a small note written in his shaky but steady handwriting. "We were Americans. We bled for it. Please remember that." Word spread fast. Articles were written. Memorials were held. Even the mayor of Grand Rapids issued a statement honoring his life and service. Flags were flown at half-staff. But the real tribute came in the silence that followed. At schools across the country, students stood for a moment of reflection after learning his story. Veterans who had never met him saluted his photo. And in homes, where his name had once been unknown, parents told their children about a man named Virgil Westdale, the pilot who wasn't allowed to fly, the soldier who fought without bitterness, and the American who never stopped believing in his country, even when it betrayed him. His story didn't end in gunfire or glory. It ended in peace, not because the world was perfect, but because he made sure his truth lived on. And in that quiet ending, there was something more powerful than any medal. Legacy. There's something powerful about the silence that follows a story like Virgil Westdale's. Not just the quiet that comes after a life well lived, but the kind that sinks into people, the kind that lingers in a classroom after a video ends, or in a living room when someone says, "You have to hear this." Virgil's story didn't become famous the way some war stories do. There were no Hollywood movies made about him, no best-selling books with his face on the cover. But that was never the point. He didn't fight for fame. He fought to live. He fought to serve. And in the end, he fought to be seen. And he was. In the years following his death, his name slowly began to echo in places it had never been before. A high school in California added a lesson plan titled The Legacy of the 442nd. At the top of the first page, there was a quote from Virgil himself. "We weren't fighting to prove we were American. We were already American. We were fighting to remind everyone else." A mural was painted on a wall near the old train station in Grand Rapids, the very tracks his parents had likely been shipped away on, bound for the internment camps. The mural showed Virgil in uniform, one hand raised in salute, the other gripping a folded flag. Behind him, the faces of his unit, young Japanese-American men, faded into the background, like ghosts watching over the city. And on Memorial Day, years after his passing, a little boy stood in front of that mural, holding his grandfather's hand. "Who's that man?" he asked. His grandfather knelt beside him. "That's someone who was told he didn't belong here, and proved them wrong." The boy stared a little longer. "Did he fight the bad guys?" "Yes," his grandfather replied. "Here and over there, because that was the truth." Virgil had fought 2 wars, one against the enemies of freedom and one against the prejudice in his own country. And in both, he stood tall. He had never wanted revenge. He never asked for apologies, even though he had earned them. He wanted people to know what happened. Not so they would feel guilty, but so they would remember and not repeat it. And people did remember. Not everyone, not enough, but some. They remembered the freezing nights in France, where snow and gunfire blurred into one endless darkness. They remembered the lost battalion and how the 402nd, outnumbered, overlooked, went in anyway and saved them. They remembered Dachau and how a group of Japanese-American soldiers were among the first to see the horror, and how history tried to erase that. And most of all, they remembered a young man who loved to fly, who had his license taken, his dreams grounded, his dignity questioned, and who still raised his hand and said, "I do," when his country asked him to serve. Because Virgil Westdale was more than a soldier, more than a Nisei, more than a name. He was a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of what America could be. In his story, there is pain, injustice, betrayal, but there is also honor, grit, forgiveness, and, somehow, still, hope. Hope that we can be better, that we can look at someone's name, someone's face, and see a fellow citizen, not a stranger. Hope that the next time history tries to forget someone like Virgil, someone quiet, someone humble, someone different, we'll remember. We'll say his name. We'll tell his story. And in doing so, we'll carry that quiet flame he kept alive his whole life, The flame that says, "We belonged all along."